The thermometer nailed to Earl Dobbins' fence post read -31 degrees Fahrenheit, -35 degrees Celsius at 9:15 in the evening. February 9th, 1947. Hardin, Montana. The wind came down from the Bighorn Mountains in long, flat sheets, not gusting, just pressing, steady and relentless, like something that had decided to stay. Every chimney in the valley was throwing smoke sideways. Every wood stove in every timber frame cabin within 2 miles was being fed faster than a man could split logs. And still, the coal found its way inside, through the caulk window frames, through the gaps between floor joists, through the walls themselves, which in many homes were nothing more than single thick pine planks and a coat of whitewash holding back a Montana winter that had no interest in being held back. Inside the Kessler place, a narrow 2-room cabin about a mile east of the river, the interior temperature had dropped to 29 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius by 10 o'clock. That's below freezing inside a house with a fire burning. Millie Kessler wrapped her youngest in 2 wool blankets and pressed him against the dog for warmth. Harold Kessler burned the chair from the corner bedroom, then the spare door frame. He was calculating whether the floorboards might come up next when his neighbor finally knocked and told him to come sleep in the barn. 3 other households that night burned structural elements, door trim, window casings, sections of shelving, just to keep the temperature survivable. One house, though, was different. Half a mile down the same road, set slightly into a low rise in the earth. A curved metal roof caught the moonlight and held it. No frantic smoke signals. No neighbor at the door. Inside, by multiple accounts recorded in local correspondence from that winter, the temperature held at 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius throughout the night. Not warm by modern standards, but survivable without burning the furniture. Survivable without blankets over the windows. Survivable while the rest of the valley struggled. The house belonged to Ray Callum, and what he had built was something no one in Hardin had taken seriously, until that February night changed everything. If you're watching this from somewhere that knows what a real winter feels like, drop a comment below and tell us where. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stick with us, because what Ray figured out is something that modern builders have almost entirely forgotten. To understand what Ray Callum built, you have to go back to the fall of 1945, 2 years before the cold snap that would prove him right. Ray was 31 years old, recently discharged from the Army Corps of Engineers after 3 years of service in the Pacific Theater. He had spent much of that time building things fast and cheap under pressure. Airfield runways, supply depots, prefabricated medical facilities. He had learned to look at material and ask not what it was designed to do, but what it could do if you put it in the right position. He came back to Hardin with $200, a plot of land his uncle had left him, and a government surplus auction catalog. That catalog is where he first saw them. Quonset huts. The Quonset hut was a direct descendant of the British Nissen hut, a prefabricated half-cylinder of corrugated steel, first manufactured in 1941 at Quonset Point, Rhode Island, for the U.S. Navy. By the end of the war, approximately 150,000 had been built and deployed worldwide. Bases across the Pacific were full of them. And now, with the war over, the military had more than it knew what to do with. Surplus Quonset panels were being auctioned off across the country for next to nothing, sometimes as low as $500 for a full 20 by 48-foot unit. Most civilians who bought them at auction used them as equipment sheds, garages, or temporary storage. A few adventurous homesteaders tried to live in them, with mixed results. The steel conducted cold like a wire conducts electricity. In winter, the interior of a standard Quonset hut was barely better than the outdoors. Frost would form on the interior walls. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The curved roof, despite its structural genius, had no insulating value whatsoever. Ray Callum knew all of this. He had slept in Quonset huts in the Philippines. He understood their weakness. But he also understood something else. Some he had observed during his time in the Corps, working with local engineers on Luzon who knew how to keep structures cool in brutal tropical heat, using nothing but mass, shade, and earthwork. The principle, he believed, worked in reverse. The question was whether anyone in Hardin, Montana, would give him the time to prove it. The answer, as it turned out, was not without a fight. Hardin in 1945 was a town of roughly 1,400 people, most of them living in timber frame homes built between 1910 and 1930. The construction methods hadn't changed much in those 30 years. Wood frame walls, single-pane windows, stone or brick chimneys, and crawl space or slab foundations that sat directly on the frost line. The frost line in south-central Montana sits at approximately 36 to 42 inches, 91 to 107 centimeters, below the surface. That means any foundation shallower than that, and most in the county was susceptible to frost heave, ground movement, and cold infiltration from below. The floor was often the coldest surface in the house. Children who slept low to the ground reported waking to find the water in their cup frozen solid. Cooking grease stored under the counter would set hard overnight. Heating these homes was an exercise in constant loss. A standard cast-iron box stove of the era, the kind found in most hardened kitchens, produced radiant heat in a roughly 10-foot 3M radius. Beyond that radius, especially in the far corners of a room, temperatures could be 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 14 degrees Celsius, colder than near the stove. The stove itself retained heat for only 2 to 4 hours after the fire died, which meant that in a serious Montana winter, someone had to get up between midnight and 4 a.m. to stoke the fire, or the interior temperature would drop to dangerous levels before dawn. Wood consumption was a constant arithmetic of winter survival. Local accounts from the 1940s suggest that a typical two-room household in the Hardin area burned between 10 and 15 cords of wood per winter. A cord is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long, roughly 128 cubic feet, 3.6 cubic meters of wood. At 10 cords minimum, that's 1,280 cubic feet of wood just to get through a single season. Cutting, splitting, hauling, stacking, and managing that supply was a near full-time occupation from September onward. And here was a cruel irony. The walls of most homes were doing almost nothing to help retain that heat. Timber frame construction of the era typically used 2x4 stud walls, a wall only 3.5 inches, about 9 centimeters, thick between interior plaster and exterior clapboard, even filled with whatever insulation was available, sawdust, newspaper, animal hair. That wall had a thermal resistance somewhere between R4 and R7 by modern calculation. Compare that to modern code-built walls, which target R20 or higher. The heat those settlers were generating was escaping almost as fast as it was being produced. This wasn't a secret. Everyone knew the houses were cold. Everyone knew the wood consumption was brutal. The question was whether anyone had a better idea. Ray Callum thought he did. Ray spent most of the autumn of 1945 doing something his neighbors considered a waste of good daylight, sitting still and watching. He watched how the cold moved across the land at night, how it pooled in the low places, how it came first from the north and then swung northeast by January, how the hillsides to the west retained a faint warmth hours after flats had given it up. He watched which animals sought out which shelters and how the earth itself behaved in hard cold, which surfaces held frost and which shed it. And he dug, not to build, not yet, just to observe. He dug a series of test holes on his property at depths of 12 inches, 24 inches, 36 inches, and 60 inches, 30, 61, 91, and 152 centimeters. He checked the soil temperature at each depth every morning for 3 weeks in November and December, using a meat thermometer he had calibrated against boiling water. What he found confirmed something he had half remembered from an Army field manual on permafrost engineering. Below the frost line, the earth maintained a remarkably stable temperature year-round. At 60 inches down on his property, the soil held between 48 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius and 11 degrees Celsius, regardless of what the air temperature was doing above. In the depths of January, with minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 29 degrees Celsius air temperatures, the Earth 6 feet down was still 49 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius. That number was the foundation of everything Ray would build. 49 degrees Fahrenheit is not warm, not by any comfortable standard, but it is 80 degrees warmer than the air during a Montana cold snap. And if you could build a structure that was thermally connected to that Earth temperature, that used the ground itself as a heat reservoir, you could dramatically reduce the amount of firewood needed to keep the interior livable. The earth wouldn't heat your house, but it would set a floor below which your interior temperature could not easily fall. The second observation came from the Quonset hut panels themselves. Ray laid several of them out on the ground and studied the geometry. The half-cylinder shape, unlike a peaked gable roof, had no flat vertical walls where cold air could press against a large, exposed surface. The curved profile shed wind rather than catching it, and if the base of the arch was anchored not at ground level but below it, embedded in a stone foundation that ran deep, the arc of the metal would begin several feet underground and rise to its peak above grade. The transition from warm earth to cold air would happen gradually, inside the mass of the wall itself, rather than abruptly at a thin timber frame. He had never seen this done. He wasn't sure it would work the way he calculated, but the physics seemed sound, and the materials were available, and the cost of being wrong was, at worst, a cold winter spent proving a theory. He began drawing plans in December 1945. By March of 1946, he had broken ground. Before we get to what happened when the community saw what he was building, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever tried anything like this? Built something unconventional that people doubted? We want to hear it, because what comes next is where the story gets interesting. The ground was still half frozen when Ray Callum drove his first stake in March of 1946. Most men in Hardin wouldn't break ground until late April, once the frost had retreated and the soil was workable without a pickaxe. Ray didn't wait. He had a borrowed team of horses, a slip scraper, and a 14-year-old neighbor named Curtis Pruitt, who needed $3 a week and something to do. The excavation took 11 days. Ray dug down 6 feet, 1.8 meters, below grade across a footprint of roughly 20 by 32 feet, 6 by 9.7 m. That's a significant hole. 3,840 cubic feet, 108 cubic meters, of earth moved by hand tools and a horse-drawn scraper. The spoil was piled to the north and west of the site, intentionally, to form a low berm that would later serve as a windbreak against the prevailing winter winds. Once the pit was at depth, Ray began the foundation walls. He had spent the previous autumn scouting limestone outcroppings along the Bighorn River drainage, stone that had been deposited in horizontal beds and could be split into rough slabs without dynamite or professional quarrying equipment. Over 4 weeks that fall, he and Curtis had hauled approximately 4,200 pounds, 1,900 kilograms, of limestone to the site by wagon and stacked it under a tarp near the excavation. The walls he built were 18 inches, 46 centimeters, thick. Not because that was standard practice. It wasn't, not for a simple homestead, but because Ray had done a rough calculation on paper, working from what he remembered of Army Corps thermal mass guidelines for tropical construction adapted in reverse for cold climates. An 18-inch limestone wall, he estimated, could absorb and release heat over a cycle of roughly 8 to 12 hours. That meant a fire stoked in the evening would be giving back warmth well into the following morning, not from the stove itself, but from the stone. Limestone was not the ideal material for thermal mass by modern engineering standards. Sandstone or granite holds heat more efficiently per pound, but limestone was what the Bighorn drainage offered in abundance, and Ray worked with what the land provided. Local accounts suggest the finished basement walls stood approximately 5 feet, 1.5 meters, above the excavated floor before reaching grade level. At that height, the occupants stood below ground on 3 sides, insulated by earth on 3 walls, with only the south-facing entry and 2 small south-facing windows rising above the surface of the land. On top of the limestone walls, Ray anchored the Quonset arch panels. He had purchased a surplus 20 by 48-foot Quonset unit from a government auction in Billings for $480, roughly the equivalent of $6,500 today. The panels arrived by flatbed in June 1946. Each corrugated steel arch section was bolted to a continuous wooden sill plate that Ray had lag-bolted directly into the top course of limestone. The geometry of the arch began not at ground level, as was standard, but 6 inches, 15 centimeters, below grade on the embedded sill, meaning the curved steel wall rose from inside the limestone foundation, not above it. The joint between stone and steel was packed with mortar of lime, clay, and animal hair, a technique Ray had learned watching Filipino builders seal tile roofs in the rain. The result was a structure that, from the outside, appeared to be a low metal hump rising gently from the earth. Neighbors who drove past during construction described it as looking like a buried freight car or a storm drain that had gotten ambitions above its station. From the inside, however, the space was surprisingly livable, 8 feet 2.4 meters at the crown of the arch, with warm stone walls on 3 sides and a wood plank floor laid directly on a 4-inch, 10 centimeters, bed of dry gravel over compacted earth floor. Ray moved in during October 1946, for months before the cold snap that would test everything he had built. Word traveled fast in the county of 1,400 people, and the word on Ray Callum's structure was not flattering. Ed Merton, who had been building timber frame homes in the Hardin area since 1921, stopped his wagon on the road one afternoon to get a better look at the finished structure. According to a letter he wrote to his brother that fall, a letter that survives in a family archive cited in local historical society records, Merton described Ray's home as a tin can sunk in a hole, and about as much use against a Montana winter as a tin can sunk in a hole. He predicted the metal roof would conduct cold straight into the living space, that the limestone walls would sweat with condensation and grow black with mold before Christmas, and that the below-grade construction would flood the moment the spring snowmelt arrived. These were not unreasonable criticisms. Each of them reflected a genuine failure mode that poorly executed below-grade and metal roof structures had demonstrated in the region before. The condensation concern was the most technically legitimate. Steel, unlike wood or stone, has virtually no capacity to buffer humidity. It simply reflects whatever temperature exists at its surface. In a cold climate, that means interior moisture-laden air hitting a cold steel ceiling will condense and drip. Ray had addressed this. He had nailed a layer of wooden lath to the interior of the arch and stretched burlap over it before whitewashing the surface, creating a modest capillary layer that could absorb and re-release condensation slowly rather than dripping. But none of his neighbors had looked closely enough to notice that detail. They saw steel and assumed the worst. The flooding concern was addressed by the gravel floor bed and a simple French drain Ray had dug along the perimeter of the foundation before laying the floor. But again, no one had asked. Gus Halverson, who ran the hardware and feed store on Center Avenue, told at least 3 customers at Ray's underground tin shack was a fire hazard, that the curved metal ceiling would trap smoke in a fire event, and that the single entry door on the south face made escape impossible in a structural emergency. Ray had, in fact, installed a second egress, a hinged steel plate in the north wall, low to the ground, that doubled as a cold air return for the wood stove's draft. But Halverson had never visited the site, and speculation had already filled the space where observation might have lived. The harshest commentary came from the County Agricultural Extension Office, whose acting director that year, a man named Willard Peck, reportedly told a meeting of the local Homesteaders Association that below-grade residential construction in Montana was an invitation to moisture, vermin, and carbon monoxide accumulation, and that anyone serious about surviving winter in the county ought to be building up, not down. Ray heard all of it. He was not a combative man by temperament, but neither was he easily moved by confident opinions that hadn't been tested. He had spent 3 years in the Corps watching engineers argue about structures, until a deadline forced him to build something and find out what worked. He trusted the test more than the argument. The test was coming. He just didn't know yet how severe it would be. The cold front that settled over south-central Montana on the evening of February 8, 1947, was not, meteorologically speaking, exceptional by historical standards. The northern Rockies had seen colder sustained temperatures before and would see them again, but for the people of Hardin and the surrounding county, it arrived with unusual speed and unusual stubbornness. Temperatures dropping 22 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius in under 6 hours on the evening of the 8th, then holding below minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 32 degrees Celsius for the better part of 4 consecutive days. The combination of speed and duration was what made it a genuine test. By the morning of February 9th, 3 households in the county had already run critically low on their wood supplies. 2 families relocated to neighbors. One family, the Kesslers, whose cabin sat a mile east of Ray's property, was burning structural lumber by nightfall, as described in a letter Millie Kessler wrote to her sister in Laurel the following week. Curtis Pruitt, now 16 and living with his family in a standard timber frame home a quarter mile from Ray's property, later recalled that the interior temperature of his family's house dropped to 31 degrees Fahrenheit minus 0.5 degrees Celsius on the night of February 9th, despite a fire burning continuously. His father cracked the windows slightly on the lee side of the house to improve the stove draft, a common trick, which helped the fire burn hotter, but accelerated the heat loss through the walls. They burned through 3/4 of a cord in a single night. Ray Callum burned approximately 1/3 of a cord across all 4 nights of the cold snap. On the morning of February 10th, with the outside temperature reading minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 33 degrees Celsius, Curtis walked to Ray's place before dawn to borrow a splitting maul his father needed. He later described what he found in testimony recorded by the Hardin Historical Society in 1971. The interior of the Quonset structure was visibly warmer than the outside air. He could feel it the moment he came through the south entry, and Ray was sitting at his table eating breakfast in a wool shirt, no coat, no hat. Curtis measured the interior temperature against the exterior using the 2 thermometers Ray kept, one inside and one mounted to the exterior wall beside the entry. Interior, 58 degrees Fahrenheit 14 degrees Celsius. Exterior, minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 33 degrees Celsius. A difference of 86 degrees Fahrenheit 30 degrees Celsius. Maintained with wood stove that had last been stoked at 5 a.m., 2 hours before Curtis arrived. The limestone walls were doing exactly what Ray had calculated. The 4,200 pounds, 1,900 kilograms of stone in the foundation walls had absorbed heat over the previous weeks of occupation and were releasing it slowly, maintaining a base interior temperature even after the active fire had died down to coals. The below-grade construction meant that 3 sides of the structure were insulated not by wall batting or timber but by earth that held at 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 to 11 degrees Celsius, regardless of the air temperature above. The curved Quonset roof shed wind rather than presenting a flat vertical surface to it, reducing convective heat loss that was stripping warm from every flat-walled timber frame in the county. Over the 4-day cold snap, Ray's wood consumption came in at an estimated 35 to 40% less than comparable households of similar size. Interior temperature at its lowest recorded point was 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, on the morning of February 11th, after the stove had gone cold overnight due to Ray oversleeping. Comparable timber frame homes in the area reported interior lows of 27 degrees Fahrenheit to 33 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 3 degrees Celsius to 0.6 degrees Celsius, during the same overnight periods, even with fires maintained. Ed Merton drove past on the afternoon of February 12th as the cold front was finally breaking. He slowed his truck, looked at the low metal arc rising from the snow-covered berm, and did not stop. But he did not say anything more about tin cans. Spring came late to Hardin in 1947, the way it always did, reluctantly in fits, with the occasional week of warmth followed by a hard freeze that reminded everyone that Montana does not surrender winter on schedule. By April, the snow had retreated enough that people began walking the roads again, visiting neighbors, trading seed stock and fence wire, and the accumulated observations of a winter survived. Ray Callum had visitors that spring. Curtis Pruitt's father, Everett, came first. He walked the perimeter of the structure with Ray, asked specific questions about the foundation depth and the stone thickness, and took notes in a pocket ledger he carried everywhere. He did not say much, but by June he had dug a partial limestone foundation under the north wall of his existing cabin. Not a full reconstruction, but retrofit, adding 14 inches 35 centimeters of mortared stone to the exterior of his coldest wall and banking earth against it to grade. The following winter, by his own account, his wood consumption dropped by roughly a cord and a half. Gus Halverson never built anything, but he started stocking limestone mortar at his hardware store the following autumn and was surprised by the demand. Within 3 years, by the winter of 1949 to 1950, local accounts and Homesteaders Association minutes suggest that at least 11 families in the greater Hardin area had incorporated some version of Ray's below-grade or high-mass foundation principles into new construction or retrofits. None of them replicated his design exactly. Some used a limestone foundation without the Quonset roof. Some buried only the north wall of an existing structure. One family dug a full root cellar beneath their existing cabin and used the thermal mass of the cellar ceiling, which was their living room floor, as a radiant heat sink. Each adaptation was different. Each one made the structure measurably more survivable. Ray Callan himself never sought recognition for what he had built. He lived in the Quonset structure until 1961, when he sold the property and moved to Billings to be closer to his daughter. By several accounts, the structure was still standing and still occupied as late as 1978. Whether it stands today is unknown. What he understood, and what the engineers and builders of his county had not stopped to consider, was that heat is not just a product of combustion. It is a product of mass, geometry, and position. A thin-walled house set on a cold foundation, surrounded by wind on all sides, loses heat almost as fast as it produces it. A structure buried in the earth, built from stone with real thermal weight, shaped to deflect wind rather than oppose it. That structure doesn't just resist the cold. It stores warmth the way a cast-iron skillet stores heat long after the burner is off. The settlers who came before Ray, the Crow and Hidatsa people who lived along the Bighorn River for centuries before any European homesteader drove a stake in the ground, had understood this. Their earth lodges, built semi-subterranean with thick earthen walls and a central hearth, maintained interior temperatures that European observers in the 18th and 19th centuries consistently described as remarkably warm, even in deep winter. The principle was ancient. The application was common sense wrapped in physics. Ray Callan didn't invent anything. He remembered something, and in a winter that stripped every shortcut bare and left the evidence in the thermometers, what he remembered kept him warm while the rest of the valley burned his furniture. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the houses we build today, the materials we ignore, the knowledge we keep almost losing, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Tell us what you'd build. Tell us what you'd change. Tell us what piece of old knowledge you think deserves to be remembered. We're going to keep finding these stories, the ones where someone quietly proved the experts wrong, and bringing them back. Don't miss the next one. Educational and historical note. This script is a dramatized historical reconstruction intended for documentary storytelling and educational purposes. Names, dialogue, and some specific details are composites or plausible reconstructions based on period-accurate engineering principles and regional historical context. Oral accounts and local records referenced are treated as verisimile reconstructions where primary sources are unavailable. This content does not substitute for licensed structural, thermal, or building engineering advice. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking any construction project.